People think an execution is the one moment where nothing can go wrong, but some prisoners walked into their own death sentence and somehow came out breathing. Not because they were lucky, because something far stranger happened behind those prison walls. And once you hear what really went on in these execution chambers, you'll start wondering whether death is as final as everyone believes. The electric chair was designed to make survival impossible, yet one man walked out of it still breathing. When Willie Francis was strapped into that wooden chair in 1946, witnesses expected a routine execution. Instead, the room filled with a sound no one had ever heard before: the crackle of electricity mixed with a teenager's terrified voice. The current surged, his body seized, and then the unthinkable happened. He kept shouting that he wasn't dead. Officials blamed a mechanical mistake, but the story didn't end there. Rumors spread instantly, whispers that the chair had been set up wrong on purpose, that someone in the prison didn't want the execution to succeed, and that the case itself was hiding details that never made it into the courtroom. And even though Willie survived the chair, he had no idea that the real battle was only just beginning. But he wasn't the only one who walked away from a death sentence that should have been guaranteed. Kenneth Smith spent decades waiting for the moment the state would finally carry out his sentence, but when the day arrived, it turned into something no one could have imagined. Instead of a swift injection, he was strapped to a gurney while a team of executioners searched his arms like they were fumbling in the dark. Needle after needle went in, missing every vein, stabbing muscle, tearing skin. Smith begged them to stop, but they kept going, even turning the stretcher upside down as blood smeared across their gloves. By the time the court ordered them to halt the execution, hours had passed and Smith was barely conscious. Lawyers called it torture, witnesses described it as chaos, and the public couldn't understand how a state with decades of experience still managed to turn an execution into a medical disaster. But the worst part? Alabama wasn't done with him. Months later, they announced a brand new method, nitrogen hypoxia, and chose Smith as the first person in history to face it. A move that sparked national outrage, and made people wonder if the state was experimenting on him rather than executing him. And if that sounds extreme, the next case proves that even a failed execution doesn't guarantee someone has seen the last of death's shadow. Rommel Broom walked into the Ohio execution chamber in 2009 expecting the end. What he didn't expect was to feel every second of it. For 2 hours, the team tried, again and again, to push poison into his veins. They poked, scraped, twisted, and stabbed until his arms were swollen and bleeding. He wasn't drifting away, he was fully awake, fully aware, and fully trapped inside his own failing execution. When officials finally stopped, the room felt stunned. This wasn't mercy, it was exhaustion. The state admitted they couldn't find a single usable vein, and Broom was sent back to his cell with more needle wounds than anyone should ever experience in a lifetime. Most people assumed the nightmare was over. But Ohio had a different idea. They wanted to try again. Lawyers fought back, arguing that forcing someone through a second execution attempt crossed the line into cruel and unusual punishment. Appeals stretched on for years, turning Broom into a symbol of what happens when the system malfunctions and refuses to admit it. But here's the part that shocked everyone: Broom didn't die at the hands of the state. After surviving his failed execution, after waiting more than a decade for them to try again, he passed away from illness on death row. Some called it luck, others called it cheating fate. But either way, he escaped the very death the government spent years preparing for. And if you think one failed execution is rare, the next story features a man the system simply couldn't kill, no matter how many times they tried. Some executions fail because of human error, but others collapse in ways that feel almost impossible to explain. Take William Jewell. He was declared dead after hanging for nearly 20 minutes, hauled to an anatomy theater, stripped, and laid out on a table, only for a servant to notice his chest moving. Minutes later, Jewell was breathing on his own. Within hours, he was sitting upright and talking, as if death had simply changed its mind. Then there was John Lee, the man the public swore had divine protection. 3 times the executioner pulled the lever. 3 times the trapdoor refused to open. Mechanics inspected it, tested it, jumped on it, and it worked flawlessly, until Lee stepped onto it again. Whether it was moisture in the wood or something far stranger, the system physically couldn't carry out the sentence while he was standing there. And Joseph Samuel's story pushed things even further. He was hanged not once, not twice, but 3 separate times, and every single rope failed. Each one was tested, each one could hold hundreds of pounds. Yet every time Samuel was lifted into the air, the rope broke or slipped like it wasn't meant to tighten around his neck. The crowd turned restless, chanting for his release, convinced they were watching a sign. 3 men, 3 different centuries, and 3 executions that simply refused to happen. Were these mechanical failures, coincidence, or moments where fate intervened in ways no one could explain? And while luck may have saved these prisoners, the next survivor's story isn't about luck at all. It's about a man who beat death more times than anyone should have been able to. Most people don't survive one execution attempt. John Smith survived so many close calls that even the courts didn't know what to do with him anymore. His first hanging in 1705 should have ended everything. He dangled for nearly 15 minutes while the crowd watched, waiting for the inevitable. But instead of going still, Smith somehow kept clinging to life. When they finally cut him down, he started breathing again, leaving everyone stunned. The near-death experience should have changed him, but it didn't. After receiving a pardon for the botched execution, Smith went straight back to breaking into homes like nothing had happened. He was arrested again, then released on a technicality. Arrested a 3rd time, and fate stepped in once more. The prosecutor died the night before the trial. It was like the universe kept throwing roadblocks between Smith and the punishment he was supposed to face. By the time he was caught years later at the age of 66, even the courts seemed tired of trying to kill him. Instead of execution, they shipped him off to Virginia, far from the city where he'd dodged death over and over again. And after that, his story fades into rumor. Some say he lived peacefully. Others claim he kept stealing until the end. But one thing is certain. Very few criminals in history have slipped through death's grip as many times as John Smith. And as unbelievable as his luck was, the next case reveals a darker side. One where surviving didn't expose fate, it exposed the system itself. Some prisoners survived because of luck. Others survived because of mechanical mistakes. But Willie Francis's case exposed something far more unsettling. What happens when the system itself is working against you from the start? Long before he ever sat in the electric chair, the deck was already stacked. A teenager with no proper defense, an all-white jury in the segregated South, missing evidence, and a confession many believe was forced. The deeper people looked, the clearer it became that Francis wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting a system that had already decided his fate. When the electric chair malfunctioned, it should have been the moment that forced officials to reconsider everything. Instead, the state pushed forward as if nothing had happened. His lawyers uncovered vanishing evidence, conflicting testimonies, and the suspicious role of a local deputy whose gun matched the murder weapon. Yet every attempt to reopen the case hit a wall. The most chilling part wasn't the failed execution, it was how quickly the courts agreed to try again. No pause. No doubts. Just a decision that the first attempt didn't count, even though it left a teenager screaming in a room full of smoke and sparks. Francis's survival didn't just reveal an error, it exposed a system willing to repeat the same punishment, even when the first attempt looked more like an accident than justice. And while his story became a symbol of racial injustice, it also served as a warning. Sometimes the most terrifying part of an execution isn't the method, it's the machinery behind the verdict. But as disturbing as this case is, the final story takes everything to the extreme, a survival so brutal that it almost feels unreal. Most execution survivors make it through because something went wrong. But Wenceslao Mogul lived through a firing squad in a way that still defies logic. After being captured during the Mexican Revolution, he was lined up with a group of prisoners, facing the one method of execution that leaves almost no room for error. The shots rang out, hitting him across the body, and everyone assumed it was over. But the commander wanted certainty, so he stepped forward and delivered the final shot at point-blank range. The one meant to end everything instantly. The world should have gone black for Mogul, yet it didn't. He stayed completely still, pretending the life had drained out of him, waiting for the soldiers to walk away. Once the area cleared, he dragged himself across the ground, pushing through the pain until he reached a nearby church. A caretaker found him collapsed at the entrance and hid him until he recovered enough to speak. His survival wasn't luck, it was a combination of instinct, sheer willpower, and a refusal to let that final moment be the end. Even after taking more than enough fire to end a life, he held on long enough to escape the battlefield and eventually rebuild his future. Years later, he became living proof that even the most certain execution can fail in ways no one can explain. Death is supposed to be absolute, final, unforgiving, yet these stories reveal a reality far stranger and far darker. Executions fail, needles miss, ropes snap, electric chairs misfire, and sometimes, the system itself hides evidence, ignores injustice, or doubles down on mistakes. From Willie Francis to Wenceslao Mogul, survival wasn't always about luck. It was about exposing the cracks in a system that claims to be infallible. When humans are in charge of life and death, errors are inevitable. Mechanical failures, legal corruption, and blatant injustice show that the cost of a mistake isn't just a record or a headline, it's a life. And when life is on the line, can any system truly guarantee justice? Or are these survivors proof that death itself isn't always what it seems? In the end, these cases aren't just stories of survival, they're a mirror. They force us to question the morality, the precision, and the humanity of a system that wields death as a tool. And they leave one haunting thought lingering long after the final word. If death can fail this many times, can we ever truly trust it to succeed when it matters most?